is the world's largest island and its smallest continent. Its wildlife are some of Earth's largest, strangest, and most deadly. This land of extremes is Australia, right now on Wild Discovery.
Australia is like nowhere else on Earth. From the delicate beauty of the Great Barrier Reef to the harsh terrain of the outback, this is a land of contrasts and contradictions. Australia's story is one of unparalleled antiquity and a long isolation by a restless sea. This is the tale of an ancient land that has forged its own destiny, of a sunburnt continent unique in biology, landscape, and people. When the first European explorers ventured into the arid center of Australia, they went expecting to find the lush shores of a fabled inland sea. Instead, they walked into one of the oldest and emptiest landscapes on Earth. The sea they searched for had dried up 400 million years ago, replaced by endless sandy deserts baking under the hot Australian sun. Even the animals seemed ancient, unfamiliar, and dangerous. The explorers found themselves strangers in an alien land. Yet, they were not alone. This seemingly inhospitable country had been inhabited by a resilient and resourceful people for tens of thousands of years.
No trash.
We had no trousers, no shirts, no shoes. We were naked. Sure, life was hard, but we were a really tough and hard people too. And there was plenty of food. We ate wild figs and wild plums, and from under the ground, wild onions. I enjoyed it back then.
Aboriginal elder Billy Warra grew up in the shadow of Ayers Rock, now known by its Aboriginal name, Uluru. Rising over 1,000 feet from the desert plain, Uluru is the largest single rock on the planet. Its mood shifting with every change of the light. Glowing like Australia's exposed heart, this remarkable monolith marks the geographical and spiritual center of Billy's timeless country. The story of Australia is as old as the Earth itself. The Earth was forged 4.5 billion years ago in the fiery birth of the solar system. The first rocks of Australia were formed soon after, on the shoreline of what would become the world's largest island. The oldest corner of the oldest continent is here in the West. This is truly the land that time forgot. Here in the Pilbara, hidden under an uncommon flush of greenery, are some of the oldest rocks in the world. dated to 3.5 billion years. But this is also a land of reptiles. Lurking amongst the tufts of spiky spinifex grass are many of Australia's 100 species of venomous snake. The Pilbara is some of the best reptile country on Earth. A magnet for snake lovers Annie and Chris Burns.
It's looking pretty good.
Oh, beautiful.
Their reptilian quarry make the most of what is to humans an extremely harsh and dangerous landscape.
My wife come close to getting a bite over here. She got bailed up in the shed one day with one that wanted to chew on her foot. But she had her boots on, that was pretty good. She came out, they thought she was catching a rattlesnake, but it was just the knees knocking.
Chris and Annie are the unofficial snake busters for the remote mining town of Tom Price. They can be called up to 6 times a day to remove reptiles that have decided to take up residence in town. More often than not, the unwanted house guests are deadly poisonous.
Well, out of the world's 32 most deadly snakes, the first 11 are endemic to Australia. And out of those, we've got 3 of the most deadly here. In the Tom Price region, we've got the desert death adder, we've got the mulga and the western brown.
It was just out here on the lawn here.
Whereabouts?
I just saw him down here. Can't be far away.
Okay, I can see him. Got him? Decent sized mulga.
It's a mulga, is it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Mulga or king brown, whatever you want to call him.
He's not a bad
They're
size
very
though.
poisonous, these ones, aren't they?
Deadly.
Deadly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, guys. It scared the living daylights out of me.
Not all the calls are for poisonous snakes. It might be this pygmy python, the smallest python in the world. Or a goanna that's taken up residence under the rim of a toilet.
This isn't one of the easiest spots to get a goanna out of. Right there. Got him.
You turn the hose off.
Okay, hose off, bag please.
But there can be real danger. Australia is the only continent where the majority of snakes are venomous, and highly so. One bite from this western brown
Got him.
can kill.
Yeah, you're not bad, snake.
There's a lot of people around Australia that do snake busting, and they'd understand fully how difficult a job it is. But most of them would be itching to get up here and get in amongst the reptiles. We're just lucky enough to be here.
The snakes are lucky, too. Released to melt back into the ancient outback landscape. The passage of eons has seen Australia abraded by the elements and worn down by time. It's as if the flesh has been stripped away to reveal the bare bones of an underlying skeleton. From here, in the Red Heart, the country's 3 million square mile vastness is inescapable. With a landmass the size of Europe or the United States, Australia ranks as the world's 6th largest country. It's also now the flattest. The McDonnell Range in Central Australia was once the mightiest mountain range on Earth. The highest peaks here stood taller than Everest. Now, it has been weathered away to a shadow of its former self. Carving away at the range has been the Finke River, the oldest river in the world. For the last 100 million years, it's been snaking its way across the landscape in this same dry, sandy channel. Most rivers in the outback only rarely run. Even when they do, they travel not to the sea, but disappear instead into thirsty desert sands. A mere lack of water, though, is not enough to stop the residents of Alice Springs from enjoying their water sports. Once a year, the townfolk turn out for the annual Henley on Todd Regatta, a day of fun in the sandy bed of the ancient Todd River. The boats have been specially modified for local conditions. But only once in the last 40 years has the regatta been canceled because the river was actually flowing. It's a different story in the Daintree region of far north Queensland. Here, in the tropical north, the mountains of Australia's Great Dividing Range meet the moist winds of the Coral Sea. The result is rain. Lots of it. With an unofficial annual rainfall of 10 meters, over 30 feet, the cloud-shrouded Thornton Peak is probably the wettest place in Australia, and one of the wettest in the world. Nestled in its damp shadow are the lowlands of Cooper Creek.
It rains over 200 days a year, and we get 5 metres of rain annually in the Cooper Creek lowlands. In the wet season, you might get 4 metres of rain, to be followed by what's referred to as the long drizzle, which is 3 months of very small amounts of rain every day, and that's the time of the year that tends to break the resolve of residents, where the sheets remain perpetually wet and mould overtakes your life.
It was this very mouldy dampness that attracted Neil Hewitt to the banks of Cooper Creek. The family now runs a small ecotourism business. Just outside the door is the oldest rainforest in the world. Over 10 times older than the Amazon, the Daintree has been festooned with jungle for at least the last 130 million years. The diversity of life here is extraordinary. Occupying less than 1,000th of Australia's landmass, the wet tropics are home to 1/3 of the continent's plants, mammals, and frogs, and 1/4 of its reptiles. Of the 19 families of ancestral flowering plant found in the world, 12 are found in this one small pocket of the Cooper Creek lowlands, compared with only 9 in the whole of South America. But it seems that many of these giant rainforest trees have survived longer than the mysterious animals that once distributed their large and often poisonous seeds. Today, only one creature is capable of swallowing many of the brightly colored jungle fruits, the cassowary. Weighing as much as a man, this giant flightless bird forages for the fruits that fall from the trees above. The cassowary's job is an important one, moving seeds from one place to another and depositing them complete with a dollop of natural fertilizer. When these forests were young, this was a role reserved by the bird's distant relatives. These forests belonged to the dinosaurs.
Coming up Australia's animal castaways become some of the world's oddest and oldest after the break.
Australia has not always been an island. For 500 million years, it was joined to Antarctica, India, and South America as part of the great Southland called Gondwana. At the time of Gondwana, over half the landmass of Australia was covered with vast primeval forests. At one stage, these forests lay so close to the South Pole that they remained dark for half the year. Like elsewhere on the planet, dinosaurs roamed the gloomy Gondwanan forests of Australia, and pterosaurs ruled the skies. But on one otherwise normal day, they had a portent of things to come. $140 million years ago, a comet found itself on a collision course with Earth. The aftermath was this mighty crater in central Australia, one of many on a continent left pockmarked with the scars of collision. Striking the ground with the force of 1 million Hiroshima bombs, the comet blasted a crater over 14 miles wide. What's left of it now is the miraculously preserved Gauss Bluff, a ring of tortured rock that was originally over 1 mile underground when the comet hit. 75 million years later, another, larger comet would hit Central America and see the dinosaurs off for good. But the event that had the biggest impact on the Australia of today was the breaking up of Gondwana. While Antarctica drifted off to an icy end at the South Pole, Australia escaped northwards into the heat. Gradually, the climate of the continent changed, and the interior began to dry. These days, there can be years or even decades between a decent fall of rain. While scattered storms support a thin cover of hardy vegetation, over half of the Australian landmass can be classified as desert, receiving less than 5 inches of rain per year. It is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. As the land dried out, animals had 2 choices: adapt or perish. Emus, the desert cousins of the cassowary, waste no energy moving the long distances between food. Neither does the kangaroo, the animal inseparable from this landscape. It was isolation from the rest of the world which allowed the Australian marsupials to develop in their own distinctive ways. On any other continent, these would be the faces of animals with hooves. Apart from the way they hop, the most distinctive thing about these marsupials is their ability to raise their young outside the body, in a pouch. This allows the female gray kangaroo to control her reproduction, to make the most of the good years, and survive the unreliable Australian climate. A mother can have a young joey suckling in the pouch, its older sibling at foot, and a tiny embryo waiting on standby. The long time an Australian marsupial spends with its mother in the pouch can make life quite demanding for those who nurse injured and orphaned wildlife.
You've fallen asleep again. Wakey, wakey.
For surrogate mum Margit Chinelli, it means a never-ending routine of bottle-feeding a joey, training a striped possum to eat insects, and making sure a ringtail possum gets the right amount of high-wire practice. It's a domestic balancing act as difficult as raising her own children.
You got hiccups. That must mean you're excited. You excited about this?
By far the most challenging of Margit's many charges is Timothy, a rainforest tree kangaroo.
This is yours. You want some of that? No. You hop in the bag.
Apart from dealing with a very bouncy personality, Margit needs to teach Tim basic survival skills, which she and most kangaroos know little about.
Is that yummy?
Like how to climb trees.
You gonna go for a walk now? Come on, we go for a walk.
That's a boy. You want to go up a tree? They're not a very graceful animal in the tree, so actually all their physical features are not really adapted so well to tree life. They haven't got an opposable thumb, they haven't got a prehensile tail. So sometimes watching Timothy in a tree, I just have to turn around and walk away. It's just so unnerving to, you think, oh, he's going to fall. Come on, back here, Timothy. Oi. Well, now you're really showing off. Well, you know you've fallen off, that's for sure. You release them slowly. It's a slow process. And then they just stay out more and more, and eventually only come back for very, very brief visits, or not at all, and we are happy with that.
Close to Margit's North Queensland home lives perhaps Australia's oldest and oddest mammal. It has lived here ever since the time of the dinosaurs. It's the platypus. This shy aquatic mammal spends most of its life underwater with its eyes shut, feeling for the electrical signals of prey with its sensitive bill. As one of only two types of ancient monotreme mammal, the platypus is a very real link to our reptilian past. The female platypus lays eggs like a lizard, yet suckles its young with milk. To see most small Australian mammals, you have to wait for nightfall. The platypus's dryland cousin is the echidna, a kind of Australian hedgehog. Most desert animals are small, like this hopping mouse, and nocturnal. The bilby is a long-eared marsupial that looks and digs like a rabbit, while the spotted and carnivorous quoll is often called a native cat. It's not, but the sad irony is that in the last 200 years, invasion by real cats and other non-native species has seen nearly all of these defenseless desert dwellers pushed close to extinction.
Below this coastal beauty are the not-so-pretty. Australia holds the world's record for shark attacks. After the break.
not all of Australia battles with an unpredictable climate. In the so-called top end of the Northern Territory, the monsoon is as regular as clockwork. Building storm clouds signal that the wet season is not far away. Dominating the landscape are huge mounds, towering up to 20 feet high. Hidden inside are vast armies of termites, tiny six-legged workers that scour the plains for food.
This is a cathedral mound, and it's actually built by a species called Nasutotermes troideae, which is the one that builds these mounds here in the territory. They're basically a harvesting species. As you can see, all these little bits of chopped up grass that are falling out the mound. You get different types of feeding groups within the termites. Some of them feed on wood, some of them feed on grass, some of them feed on litter. So this is actually, as you can see, a grass harvester. So what they actually do is the nest actually extends sort of underground, and then they have a whole lot of foraging trails that extend out from this under the ground, and they just follow them. They can go for 50, 100 metres, and then all of a sudden they'll surface near the grass tuft that they're going to harvest.
Termites are one of the few creatures capable of extracting many nutrients from these tough grasses growing on such ancient and infertile soils. They've become the basis of the food chain here, both the most important and least appreciated of the top end's wild creatures. When the monsoon finally comes, termites head for the high-rise security of the mounds and their stockpiles of neatly cut grass. Creeks, swollen by the monsoon, thunder off the escarpment and onto the floodplains of Kakadu National Park. Once more, the water brings life and the promise of a good season to come. Waiting patiently in this muddy paradise is the saltwater crocodile, undisputed master of this land. It was into this deceptively peaceful landscape that humans first walked over 60,000 years ago and have stayed ever since. There is no culture on Earth which has lasted as long as that of the Australian Aborigines. They have survived over 2,000 unbroken generations since their ancestors arrived mysteriously during the last ice age. Aboriginal people had been decorating the rocks of Australia long before cavemen painted the walls of Lascaux in France. Recorded here are animals now extinct, and recent events, like the arrival of the white man.
Before the whitefellas ever arrived here, we lived a really good life. We lived mostly on meat, kangaroo and goannas in the bush. We had no idea of the existence of white people.
The knowledge needed to survive on this unforgiving continent has passed down the millennia in an unwritten mixture of practical advice and functional mythology, known variously as law or the dreaming. But the sudden arrival of the outside world has disrupted traditional ways and fractured the 600 or so original clan groups.
No, to say like meat, we say currami. In English is the meat.
No matter how successful modern Aborigines are at keeping this wealth of knowledge alive, the turn of the 20th century marks the last generation of those, like Billy Warra, who grew up knowing only the traditional way. Perhaps Australia's biggest contradiction is that in a continent so old, there is a nation so young. Modern Australia began here in Sydney, little more than 200 years ago. From its humble beginnings as a penal colony set as far from Britain as possible, one of the world's premier cities has arisen, home to about 4 million people from all corners of the globe. Although Australia has so much open space, it has become the most urbanized country on Earth. Almost 80% of the total population of 19 million live huddled in the fertile southeast corner of the continent. Three out of every 4 people live within an hour's drive of the coast. And what a coast it is. The coastline stretches 23,000 miles, the longest of any country. A single beach can be 110 miles long.
4, 3, 2, 1.
But for all this coastal beauty, there are plenty of beasts down below. Australia boasts the world record for shark attacks. A brush with the lethal box jellyfish can cause death in 3 minutes. Sea snakes are 10 times more venomous than their counterparts on land. And the tiny blue-ringed octopus can leave you dead with a single painless bite. The crowning glory of Australia's underwater world is the Great Barrier Reef, lying along the tropical eastern coastline of the continent. The reef stretches for more than 1,400 miles and is so large it can be seen from space. It's not a single reef, but a network of some 3,000 separate reefs and islands, which together form the largest living structure on Earth. Built from the accumulated efforts of countless generations of tiny coral polyps, its limestone walls provide the living architecture for a coral kingdom home to creatures of every imaginable shape, color, and disposition. Lord of all the reef's creatures is fearsome top predator, the tiger shark.
Coming up, the Australian desert's Rip Van Winkle. This strange creature sleeps buried for years when Wild Discovery continue.
Shane Down is no stranger to sharks. In fact, he actively seeks them out. Most weekends, Shane and friend Pete West spend their leisure time in the unlikely pursuit of swimming freely with tiger sharks, normally ranked as the world's #2 man-eater. This is not a sport for the faint-hearted. Shane approaches a wild 13-foot tiger with only a camera and his swimsuit for protection.
It's extraordinary, the interaction between Shane and the tigers. That's something I've never seen before. We filmed tigers in the past, but always from a safe distance, and When we worked with Shane and we saw how he could interact with them, it was just extraordinary. You have to be able to counter their moves and always be facing them. It's a graceful motion, if you like. It's almost a dance you'll see them do.
I love playing with the sharks. I've probably spent now 200 hours in the water out here with these guys, and not once have I looked like getting eaten. I've probably been in the water with 60 to 70 tiger sharks, up to 14 feet in length, and still got all fingers, toes, and bits of meat. If there's only one shark, you haven't got a problem, but if you've got anywhere between 4 and 6 sharks, you've really got to keep your eyes open.
A lapse in concentration could see these powerful and intelligent predators switch their attention quickly from bait to bone. Shane and Pete are more aware than most that even a gentle bite would be one best avoided.
If they get upset with me, I just point them in Pete's direction.
And I look to Shane to distract them so that I can make a clean getaway.
The heartbeat of this continent of extremes has always been the rhythm of the sun. With every outback sunrise dawns another challenge for survival. For the Moloch, it's time once more to stir into action. The Moloch, or thorny devil, has raised ant-eating to an art form. Positioned over a line of ants, he picks them off one at a time, relying on his own spiny hide to avoid being on a menu himself. This extraordinary lizard has another trick up its sleeve, the ability to catch the first raindrops from a passing storm. The Moloch's unusual skin sucks up water like a sponge and channels it down towards its mouth for drinking. Every couple of decades, the desert receives a deluge and the outback undergoes a complete transformation. Deep below the surface, a strange creature has been awoken from a long slumber in the sand. For years, the desert burrowing frog has been waiting for rain heavy enough to warrant an expedition to the surface. It will only be a brief visit, just long enough to eat and reproduce, before she burrows to wait again.
Coming up, their outward strength hides an inner weakness which threatens Australia's cuddliest. After the break.
For a short while after rain, a waterhole at the base of Uluru becomes a busy and noisy place as animals seldom seen make up for lost time. It's time to wash dust from the feathers and take advantage of some easy pickings. Such rain has always meant good times ahead.
When it rained in places like Uluru, the creeks would fill with water, good clear rainwater which we liked to drink. We'd be so happy we'd run straight up to the water and it would be full to the brim. We'd simply lean over and drink. Afterwards we'd climb over the rocky outcrops and we'd hunt kangaroo and rock wallaby. That was the only life we knew. The land was food.
Across the continent, Australian plants are finally adapted to the erratic rainfall and poor soils. There are over 500 species of the quintessential Aussie tree, the eucalypt, a form which has evolved to dominate nearly every landscape from the desert to the sea. These trees are the toughest hardwoods on the planet. The mightiest eucalypt of all is the mountain ash. Towering over 300 feet, it is the tallest flowering plant on the planet. But the hardy nature of this vegetation has a drawback. The eucalyptus oils are highly inflammable and make Australia the most fire-prone continent on Earth.
Residents have been expecting an onslaught of fires.
In 1994, Sydney was ringed by bushfire. Fanned by hot, dry winds, the fires raced through the crowns of the trees. The volatile oils reaching flashpoint and exploding like bombs in the face of the advancing fires. But within weeks, life was bursting back. Most of the Australian vegetation is well adapted to fire. The blackened bark of the eucalypt reflects most of the heat away from the heartwood. Other plants even need the fire to seed and germinate. Within only a few years, the Sydney bushland rose again like a green phoenix from the black ashes. But the Australian bush can only take so much. In the 200 years since European settlement, over 50% of native forests have been cleared, prime lands needed not only for people, but also for wildlife. Researcher Steve Phillips is concerned for the fate of a very famous Australian, the koala. The furry marsupial that has made its special diet the almost indigestible leaves of the eucalypt.
There's probably more nutrition in a piece of cardboard than what there is in a eucalyptus leaf, and that about sums it up. They have evolved with their sort of eucalyptus food trees over millions of years, and it's a very complex relationship. The trees that they feed on in areas like this, things like tallow woods and grey gums and red gums, the koalas further south can't eat them.
To compensate for the low energy of their food, koalas tend to move slowly and spend much of their time asleep. They seem part wild Australian animal and part cuddly toy.
You know, I sort of consider myself really lucky to be a zoologist in Australia and to be able to work with animals like this. And, you know, Australia has an incredible natural history, and that, in reality, is our legacy to the rest of the world.
Nowhere else in the world does the legacy of the past and the promise of the future sit so close together. In a time-worn ritual, giant fruit bats leave their roost for another night of foraging in the Sydney suburbs. But they fly over a great southern land that is no longer an island isolated from the modern world. The passage of the last millennium. 1,000-year blink in the land that has seen most of history slip by. With a continent this extreme, Australia's future is bound to be extraordinary.
A land of extremes, where the lovable and lethal live side by side. Discover what you didn't know about one of the most beautiful and dangerous places on Earth. Extreme Australia. Own it on home video. For only $19.95 plus shipping and handling, you can become part of the adventure. Have Extreme Australia, nearly an hour in length, delivered to your door. To order, call 1-800-518-9559. Because there's no thrill like discovery.